Guys, I have some shocking news. Christianity has finally been disproven. Check this out.
So it's been just under a week since my podcast with Joe Rogan dropped, and it's been quite the week. I did want to come on here, though, and say a few things. My time with Rogan was amazing, but both myself and others have caught some things I said that weren't correct. And so, in light of that, I'm going to be making a response video to myself. I think it's the 10th article of the Mormon Church is that they believe the Bible insofar as it is translated. It's not the 10th, Wes. You lied. It's the 8th article of the Mormon Church that says that.
It's false.
Egypt is like Greece in that you have you can go to the Pantheon and you see that kind of stuff, right?
Pure fiction.
The Pantheon? Are you kidding me? The Pantheon is in Rome. Do you mean the Parthenon?
We made this one up.
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once. I'm pretty sure that's 500. Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. You said it wrong again?
It's a made-up tale.
Ignatius of Antioch, arguing that there are only 4 Gospels. He's in the 2nd century.
It's a total fabrication.
Ignatius? I think you meant Irenaeus? Listen, Wes, even Rogan catches you in your own mistakes. The oils in your hands are more abrasive than latex or even cloth. So
the oils are more abrasive?
No, sorry, I said that wrong. They're less abrasive.
Okay. You are fake news.
Now, obviously, I'm being a little bit self-deprecating. These are slips, ones that in a 3-hour plus, no topics outlined beforehand, no notes, non-linear conversation happen. And so I hope that you can give me a break for these obvious and clear missteps.
Okay, if you're a Christian and you almost had a coma experience, forget about it. I was just kidding. If you're an atheist, then you were rejoicing and jumping up and down. But I want to tell you this, as you just saw, the most popular online Christian evangelical biblical scholar and debater now, from Billy Carson to Joe Rogan to PBD podcast to other places, Wesley Huff made a few mistakes, in the 3-hour podcast that any one of us could make, but he actually hit the bullseye, but he just didn't hit it dead center. And so now we know what the Bible says, that, sin is basically an archery term in the Greek. When the New Testament was written, it was used as an archery term if you don't hit the bullseye. It's not that Wes didn't hit the bullseye. He did, but he wasn't specifically exactly correct regarding the 400 apostles, people who saw Jesus was 500, or he wasn't exactly correct in the Mormon doctrine, 8 or 10. I make those mistakes sometimes too when I share the gospel or talk about apologetics or biblical documents, because I'm well studied on that too, just like Wes. Is that we can all make mistakes, but what makes a difference is that whether somebody could respond to those mistakes and whether they could actually admit, you know what, I messed up. And this is the biggest difference between Billy Carson and Wesley Huff. So check out what Wesley Huff said regarding the biggest mistake they made regarding the dead Isaiah, the Isaiah Dead Sea Scroll. And also, you might also see Alex O'Connor reaction about the resurrection, which again is not a mistake. Jesus claimed to be God. He claimed to be resurrected in all 4 Gospels. So check this out and see what Wes said about himself.
There is, however, criticism I'm seeing online that I think does require some attention and correction on my part. At around the 40-minute mark, Joe asked me a question about the Great Isaiah Scroll. And when he asks me how close it is to the modern Hebrew copies of Isaiah, I say that it is word for word identical to the later Masoretic text. This was admittedly a hyperbolic statement that I should have been much more careful on. My area of expertise when it comes to manuscripts is almost exclusively New Testament, although I do have some work with a handful of 1st century Greek fragments on the Dead Sea Scrolls for comparative work, and I note in my doctoral dissertation instances of parashot, division markers in the Hebrew text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, up front, I am not, nor do I claim to be, a Dead Sea Scrolls expert, but let me tell you why I said what I said. What was going on in the back of my mind was a quote that I was recalling from Old Testament scholar Gleason Archer's A Survey of the Old Testament, where he talks about the copies of Isaiah found in Qumran Cave 1 in 1947, that they were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscripts previously known, proving to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible, and more than 95% identical to the Masoretic text, specifically specifically the Leningrad Codex, calling it almost letter for letter with that manuscript. Also, I had only a few months previously to this discussion with Rogan read Old Testament textual critic Emmanuel Tove's Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, where he breaks down the variants of 1Q Isaiah B and compares them to the Leningrad Codex, describing the differences with the word minutia. Granted, both Archer and Tove are talking about 1Q Isaiah B, and my statement to Rogan was specifically in context to 1Q Isaiah A, but that is what was going through my mind when I had the conversation. At the same time, I have actually been in contact with a number of Old Testament scholars, even ones who specialize in 1Q Isaiah A itself, who have assured me that although there is disagreement across the scholarly spectrum, the statements are equally applied across both documents. However, what I should have said to Rogan is what I said to Billy Carson when he brought up his statement about Codex Sinaiticus, that Sinaiticus is nearly identical to modern Greek critical texts that we use to produce translations today. Rogan's reaction to the correction of wording should be exactly the same. It is a wow moment. And please hear me out here. I do not think there aren't textual variants in the Isaiah Dead Sea Scroll texts. I don't. In fact, later on in my conversation with Rogan, I specifically say ancient Hebrew doesn't have a vowel system in its writing that's overly comprehensive. And so in the Middle Ages, when you have these groups of Jews who are copying these Hebrew scriptures, who aren't speaking it as much as they're reading it, you got to figure out how to pronounce it because vowels make a difference. What I'm pointing out there is that there is an entire vowel system with the manuscripts of the later medieval text that are completely absent from the ancient Hebrew copies that we have, like that of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That means that there are going to be variants that are counted and included that have to do with vowels absent from ancient manuscripts that are present in medieval ones. I'm not saying that those are all of them or even most of them, but that even that statement to Rogan is a tacit admission that there are, of course, differences. The same thing goes for Codex Sinaiticus. There are multiple textual variants between Sinaiticus and the medieval copies, and then the modern critical text we use to make English translations today. However, the vast majority of these are almost completely inconsequential, have no bearing on when we translate them into English, and don't impact any essential Christian doctrine that could not be derived from other texts absent of textual complexity throughout the manuscript traditions. If Rogan had done what I did to Billy and asked, "Do you mind if I ask a clarifying question?" and pressed me on what I meant by word for word, I would have actually outlined the fact that no two handwritten documents ever match exactly, but that the overwhelming agreement between the Isaiah scroll and the later Masoretic text is shocking, despite orthographic and minor scribal differences. So, to summarize, was my hyperbolic statement to Rogan a dishonest attempt to pull the wool over Rogan and his audience's eyes? No. Was I participating in disingenuous and underhanded apologetic tactics to try and gain points at the expense of truth? No. Should I have been more careful in my statement on Rogan about the Great Isaiah Scroll and used much more precise language, something to the effect of nearly identical rather than word for word identical, in order to not bring unnecessary and unfortunate scrutiny upon my discussion with him? Yes, but I hope you can see why I said what I said, and forgive me for my lack of precision.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true. In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text, that is, the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1 that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600.
But it needs to be emphasized that the majority of these discrepancies are about tiny issues like spelling, not even necessarily errors of spelling, just differences. One scholar notes that these variations are mostly occasioned by considerations of orthography. Orthography is the conventional spelling system of a particular language, kind of like how Americans might use this spelling, color, C-O-L-O-R, but the British people weirdly put a U in that word. The Great Isaiah Scroll, it's under discussion here, contains spellings that reflect its own historical context. So that wouldn't affect the word-for-word claim that Wes made. Word for word doesn't necessarily mean word for identically spelled word. So the 2,600 figure here is potentially very misleading for onlookers. Now, to his credit, Alex acknowledges that most of these variations are very small.
Now, most of these variants are small. They're differences in spelling, for example, but some of them are more significant. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version. They're just not there.
He proceeds to quote from the digital Dead Sea Scrolls project to buttress this point, and he's correct about the scroll in question. However, there are multiple scrolls of Isaiah found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in these different caves at Qumran. And one scroll is nearly complete, that's the Great Isaiah Scroll, but there's many other fragmentary texts. The same website that Alex quotes from to get the 2,600 figure also notes around 20 additional copies of the book of Isaiah were found there. And in other manuscripts, that part of Isaiah 2:9 and Isaiah 2:10 are included. And that again is noted from the same website that Alex quoted from. Now, if I heard him correctly, Wes seemed to acknowledge that not all of the Dead Sea Scrolls have the same degree of accuracy. So perhaps he was talking about the overall information yielded from the Dead Sea Scrolls as a collection of texts, rather than just one manuscript among them, because he's certainly aware of the diversity of manuscripts that we have.
It says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video. But
Alex introduced the adverb explicitly there, if you listen carefully. That's not necessarily what a Christian must maintain. I don't think that's what Wes said. He was pretty much just summarizing a standard Christian view in the context of making other various claims.
He was walking around first century Roman-occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection.
Wes has a whole video about this, focusing on Mark's gospel. Check that out in the video description. I think Wes's position is very strong here. I've argued for this at greater length in this video. That's also in the video description. Let's just summarize this to defend Wes's claims there. First, even in John's gospel, Jesus does not walk around saying, I'm God. The claims of deity are still kind of oblique there, and they come up in the context of ministry and his conflict with the Jewish leadership. Similarly, in the earlier three gospels, Jesus makes claims of divine authority and divine identity in the context of ministry and in a very Jewish way. Now, it's not necessarily surprising that the way Jesus claims to be God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke will look a little different from how he claims to be God in John, because everything in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is a little different from the Gospel of John. Nonetheless, there is substantial evidence from these first three Gospels that Jesus did claim to be God. First of all, he receives worship, which is a significant point of testimony. Second of all, the whole plot of these Gospels is getting crucified for blasphemy. That's the whole narrative that drives everything. And at the start of Mark's Gospel, you have the Pharisees saying, who has authority to forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus is responding saying, I have that authority. At the end of Mark's gospel, Jesus claims to be the figure of Daniel 7, who has divine authority to judge the world. Here's the thing, is that a passage like that, this is why I emphasize the Jewish context and the context of ministry. Jesus didn't come into the world just to teach systematic theology. He's doing ministry, but we may not realize the significance of what he's saying from Daniel 7, but his contemporaries did. You can see their response there. I'll put the text back up there. They're tearing their clothes and crucifying him for blasphemy here. Now, Mark 2 and Mark 14 are generally taken to go back to the historical Jesus, even by critical scholars, and they're consistent with the general portrait of Mark's gospel and the general conflict, the general plot, as well as the general portrait of all four gospels, albeit with variation. We have here a man whose ministry gets him crucified for blasphemy. So while it's true that Jesus doesn't walk around saying, I'm God, or God is a Trinity and I'm the second member, we wouldn't necessarily expect that. His claims of divine identity and divine authority come out in the context of what he came to do in inaugurating the kingdom of God, and they have kind of a Jewish accent, but they're there.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. But this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing.
After this, Alex goes on to emphasize how little we know about this event, and he argues that the term more than or over in 1 Corinthians 15:6 perhaps means over them, as in the sky above them. But even if we granted that, that doesn't really seem to move the needle too much. We can just say, fine, okay, for the sake of argument, we could say it's not more than 500, it's just 500. Two observations. First, Wes didn't place a ton of weight on that one particular point. This was just one piece of data that was given in response to Joe's question about how many people saw Jesus. Second of all, Paul's testimony should not be written out of court simply because he doesn't give us any details about all these appearances. Remember that Paul is writing this letter in the early 50s AD. This is from 1 Corinthians, so written around somewhere early 50s, and he's likely quoting an even earlier tradition in this passage in 1 Corinthians 15. So we are within 2 decades of Jesus' death. Some scholars make the argument that it's implausible that Paul would fabricate an appearance to hundreds of people at a time when there's ample opportunity for fact-checking. And people can say, where is Paul getting this? But even if you throw out verse 6, okay, take the reference to I worry here that the focus is getting put so much on these 500 people, this appearance, that the rest of Paul, and even the rest of 1 Corinthians 15, is sort of getting overlooked here. We have to work through the other people mentioned in this passage and in other passages in Paul. Paul is identifying by name eyewitnesses of the resurrection, like James, the other apostles, himself. And this is happening within living memory of the ministry of Christ. That is the important point that I took Wes to be making.
And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus' ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said.
So all of this focus on the particularities of this appearance to the 500 and other things that come up, like when we date the Gospel of Luke, can obscure the larger point that Paul's writings provide named eyewitnesses for the resurrection within 20 years of Jesus' death. And for ancient history, that is remarkably early attestation for an event. Now, Alex claims that Paul himself didn't actually experience or even claim to experience the resurrected Jesus in the flesh.
So as you saw in the past few minutes of footage from Wesley Huff and Alex, Gavin Ortlund, another biblical scholar, you saw that when he was talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, he was actually accurate, but not directly accurate, where he said that they're virtually word for word to Joe Rogan. And I knew what he meant because I've studied the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they're transmitted from the Masoretic text. I knew they were about 95% accurate, and so that's when Wes clarified it, because a lot of the atheists called him out. Even Alex O'Connor, who's uncharacteristic of him to call out somebody in the call-out reaction video. He usually doesn't do that. He usually makes very thoughtful videos, but I think because Wes just taken over the whole media space and online space from all the YouTube videos in the world. I mean, everyone around the world is watching about the defense of Christianity from Brother in Christ Wes. But Alex responded by saying, yeah, he was totally inaccurate, but he missed the forest from the trees. And so even though Wes did get some wrong, again, I'm not perfect, he's not perfect, we don't worship each other, we don't worship men, we worship Jesus Christ alone, like Wesley said. But the thing is that what he was pretty dead on is that it is virtually word for word accurate in 95% of the text, because there are more than one copy of Dead Sea Scrolls. There's like 20, as you saw the guy Gavin talk about. And so in those texts, there's variations, there's textual criticism. Of course, no one is denying that. But the truth is that the ability to see that the context remains the same, that the meaning remains the same, is actually seen in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in a lot of the copies, compared to the Masoretic and the Leningrad Codex that was used from 800, 900 to 1000 AD, that was used for the King James Version translation. So he wasn't absolutely 100% accurate, but he was like 99.5% accurate. And so in light of classical studies, a lot of people say that these things are virtually like copied word for word. They don't have to be 100%, but in classical studies, because nothing that we have is 100% ever certain, you can make statements like this. So it's not necessarily that Wes lied. I mean, I've followed this guy for years before he became big now, and as an evangelist, missionary, apologetics guy myself, like him, not to his caliber of studies though, because I don't know any of the languages myself, but I've known all these facts before, and anyone can make these mistakes. And like I said before, the question comes down, can you humble yourself and say, hey, I made some mistakes? Because I know I've apologized before to people that I've talked to, and I said, hey, I'm going to say this, but I said this way, and it gives you credibility. And that's the biggest downside between a humble spirit and a prideful spirit. And this is why I want to pivot towards the Billy Carson thing, because Alex O'Connor is more of a rational atheist. He's not like one of those new atheists that are so angry, but he still himself comes up with every single reason to never believe in any kind of God. I mean, why doesn't he just see that intelligence demands that there is intelligent design behind everything? Even if he doesn't believe in the God of the Bible, but he still remains a staunch atheist. But people like Billy Carson, they believe they're their own God. And so when you believe something like that, you're going into another territory where everything you say, like, yeah, I'm right, I studied this, I've researched this. And the thing is, Billy Carson is more of a trust me bro kind of guy. It's like, trust me bro, I looked it up online, I studied Zecharia Sitchin. Billy himself said that Zecharia Sitchin was a big influence on him. And even Wesley and other people say, even atheists, that Zecharia Sitchin had no idea what Sumerian language was. He didn't know the translations. There's even Dr. Michael Heiser, who died recently, a biblical scholar too, very well spoken of. He said that Sitchin did not know what the Anunnaki and the UFOs, none of that was connected in the Sumerian tablets. If you read them online, it was just, making dots where there weren't any dots, because no one really understands the whole Sumerian language. Not even scholars like Wesley Huff, who's getting his PhD in those languages. So this is what separates a man from a boy. It's like, are you going to be prideful your whole life, or are you going to say, hey man, I messed up here? Even if Wes wasn't lying, he didn't mean to lie, but people get things wrong. But the thing is that in the beginning, like I said, this proved Christianity. No, it didn't. That's what everyone would love to see, because people like Myth Vision, they're atheists. They want to disprove Christianity. They say it's a myth and epic of Homer and a copy of Dionysus. Yeah, all that stuff. I've heard that, grew up with that, from my family. Still doesn't disprove the uniqueness and amazing transformative power of Christianity, and how it just makes you into a whole new holy person, which other religions don't, and that Jesus Christ is a true person, a true spirit, and a personal being who you can experience, who can transform inside out, and you can talk to Jesus. You can't talk to Homer and Dionysus. People have tried that, but they don't respond. And so the thing is that Jesus is heads and shoulders, trillions of heads and shoulders above every other myth, even if there's some similarities. Again, like C.S. Lewis said, Jesus was the myth come true. He was all the desires of all the people like Socrates that came true. And so C.S. Lewis, who was the most epic classical mythologist of his time in World War II, he knew stuff better than us do maybe at that time. Depending on the sources that he read, he understood that Jesus Christ was not just some myth. Either he was a liar, he was a lunatic, like a crazy guy claiming to be God and the Messiah, or he was God himself, because to claim that somebody resurrected from the dead is insane. But to claim that as fact and actually die for it, and show that there is evidence for it because you couldn't find his body for 2,000 years, then that means something amazing happened and supernatural. So don't let this stuff, people don't get things right perfectly, keep you away from the Bible or Christianity. We don't have any other document that is as close as the Dead Isaiah Scrolls, the Scroll 1, Scroll 2. 95% accuracy is incredible. It's unheard of in the biblical or the scholarship world of Homer's epics and the Iliad. All these things is unheard of. So I want you guys to really keep your heart and head open, because God is calling some of you to himself. I mean, he's calling all of you, but if you're a child of God, keep sharing the gospel. If you're not, I urge you, open up your heart to Jesus, read the Bible, it is accurate. Don't let these textual variations keep you from the central message that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, prophesied in Isaiah 53, 7, 9, prophesied in Genesis, prophesied in Deuteronomy 17 through Moses. He was prophesied in all these books, Micah and Zechariah, and he was pierced for our transgressions. He was beaten for iniquities, and he died on the cross, and he rose again from the dead, and he can deliver you from your sins. So like Wes said, I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, he's not perfect, nobody's perfect, but only Jesus Christ is the perfect one. God bless.